called Wild Thing. This is a totally made up pose. I don't know if this came from Anusara a decade or whatever ago when they started creating all these crazy new poses. Kamat Karasana, I think is what they call it, and then made up name in Sanskrit. But whatever, it's a cool pose, and it's kind of like a variation if side plank and wheel pose had a baby. That's kind of what happens, Wild Thing. So it's a beautiful shoulder opener, chest opener, and there's lots of ways to get into it that can be safe and supportive for your students. So let's dive in. Component parts for Wild Thing. So here's what Wild Thing looks like, right? You wind up about here. If you're doing the pose, I think called rock star, it's like both feet like this. Whatever, they're like variations all the same thing. And so in this pose, let's look at the foundation. The foundation is my feet, yes, but also my hand. And so whenever the hand plays a key role in the foundation, well, we're talking about hands and wrists, right? It's like our other hand balances. So I need to educate the hand and the wrist. Also, I need to find scapular stability. This is so crucial in this pose, is the feeling of the scapula pulling down and hiking forward up into your chest to help you get the pose. So scapular stability and, of course, thoracic extension. It's a back bend. Now the legs aren't totally neutral here. This leg is externally rotated, but I'm still working that midline action. Right? The upper arm is in flexion, external rotation. This is honestly though, this is kind of like just the cherry on the sundae, so whatever. Really the action here is of the shoulder blade and the external rotation of the upper arm. It's the external rotation of the upper arm, like screwing the shoulder blade into the socket that lets me turn my chest up towards the sky. So just to recap, we have hands and wrists, we have scapular stability, thoracic extension, yeah, a little bit of core, for sure, midline hugging in, other arm in flexion, right? But really the juice is through this line here of the upper chest. Yeah. And you know what I might throw in as kind of like a little hat box or extra one is working the glutes, because you got to really work your glutes to lift your hips up so they're not dropping down like droopy. Droopy Wild Thing would be here. The glutes in the backs of the legs working to lift up is really important to getting the whole action of the pose. All right, there we go, component parts. Stages of the peak. Okay, so this brings up how do you get into the pose. For me, I get into this pose from Vasishthasana side plank. You know, you hear that thing about flipping your dog. You know, people are in downward facing dog, they lift a leg up and then they do this thing. I hate that because you're asking people who may or may not have the capacity to do it to drop their leg back with control, right? Into like this massive back bend. So I'm not such a fan of that entrance. For me, it feels a little bit more controlled to come from side plank, turn, tuck, lift, right? That feels to me like a little bit more stable. And when we have such an opening pose, my preference is to stabilize first and then work the expansion within the boundaries of that stability. So you're gonna get my bias here, which is like, I teach this from side plank. So stages of the peak, right? Could be, well, let's just talk about modifications. Somebody who couldn't be on their hands, we would want them to have a back bend experience. So maybe I would have them do bridge, right? Something like that. Or camel pose can also be another way to active, have a big back bend experience, but not put weight on their hands and their wrists. So there's that. First, we want to think about non-weight bearing version first. If we're moving into weight bearing on the hands, then, you know, my stage one, right? Well, first of all, my stage one is always going to be like a supported Vashisthasana, right? So here or here, and just really working the action of the shoulder blade, scooping up, right? If they can bring the toe back, and this might be stage two, right? I'm just working on the lift of the hips. Stage three, turning the chest open to lift the arm up, right? So the stages here are going to be more determined by how deeply your students go into the pose. So once they're in the opening shape, right? Once they can do this, toe behind them, then it's up to them, right? How much can they keep their shoulder blade on their back and open their upper back, open their chest? So they're going to have lots of range in here based on their own body type. But I would start off with a non-weight bearing version of a back bend just to give people that option. For me, stage 1 is going to be a version of side plank. Stage 2 is going to be progressive and deeper experiences of the actual form of the pose. Stages of the peak. All right, everybody, teaching tips for Wild Thing. Okay, hands down, the most important thing that you have to get into students' bodies is the action of the shoulder blade. So external rotation of the upper arm, and then wrapping the shoulder blade down and up, right? Getting the shoulder blade up and into their body. It's this stability that is most important because this is the most at-risk joint, I would say, in this pose. So I always teach it again, as you've heard, I always teach it from side plank. So, when we're in this, I would teach this, right? And then I'll try to teach the actions of the shoulder blades in non-weight bearing poses. So for example, here we are, Anjaneyasana, my hand is out. I will have people grab their shoulder blade, pull it down, pull it underneath, so they themselves can feel, oh, hey, I can really externally rotate this bottom arm and pull the shoulder blade onto my back. Woo, see how I can find that lift there. I'm gonna teach them levity in earlier versions of side plank. Woo, get the hips up. Woo, right? In different poses like Parshva I might have them work on lifting up rather than just kind of sinking down, but finding the lift of the waistline, right? Oh, because that's what they really need to support the pose. So even when you're working on, your back bends and things like that, work on hugging the outer arms in and getting the shoulder blades up and into the chest, up and into the chest. So that's the key action that you're going to want to pre-educate so that by the time we get to the peak pose, they're kind of like, oh yeah, I remember this feeling. Another key teaching tip is to teach root rebound. You got to teach levity out of gravity. Anytime you're doing Vashisthasana, right? I'm thinking press down to lift up, press down to lift up, press down to lift up. Push through your hand to lift your shoulder blade up and into your chest. Push down to lift up, right? I always teach when I'm coming out, I make them do it with control. I make them come into side plank first so that they still have gas in the tank, right? To teach them how to control that, because poses that get wild and big and expressive can sometimes get a little bit out of control. And in this pose where we have so much weight in the shoulder, we want to protect students. So that's the key thing, honestly, with this pose, is teaching the action of the scapula, kind of drawing in so that they can then externally rotate their bottom arm to turn their chest up. That's the key action. So when I'm in this pose, right, as I screw my hand into the floor, that's what lets me turn my chest. I'm not actually rotating my spine, I'm rotating at the shoulder girdle to turn my chest up, which is like a massive opening for the pec too. The arm isn't totally in extension, it's actually more like out to the side, if I'm actually being really clear about it. And then it kind of moves back behind us, right? So if I were showing you this, not in, right? So I start off here, and this is me in my side plank. As I start to turn my chest up, this arm goes progressively back behind me, and I draw my shoulder blade down to lift my chest up, and then it comes back to the side. So really that's the action in the shoulder girdle that we need, is teaching this to lift the chest. And you can do that in lots of non-weight bearing ways. You could be in Virabhadrasana 2, right? And teach screwing the arms open and lifting the chest, turn it into a little back bend. In your high lunges, you could teach, take the arms wide, turn the palms open, pull the heart in, lift the chest, find the back bend there with the shoulder blades staying down and onto the back, because this is that position of the arms that we have in Wild Thing. So there we have it. Shoulder blade, shoulder blade, shoulder blade is the key teaching tip. And giving students progressive stages and benchmarks, right? So if you can keep your hips lifted, tack your toe down behind you in side plank, right? Now, if you can keep your hips lifted and buoyant, then take your toes behind you. Screw your hand into the floor, pull the shoulder blade to the back, and wrap your rib cage up to the sky. This is where the juice is. What? And you could always get, this is a pretty generous stance. People aren't too close, so people can often get this beautiful shoulder opening here in a way that they can't necessarily access and wheel. So really fun pose to play with. There are some teaching tips to try, so add them in and let me know how it goes. Hey everyone, so this week we looked at Wild Thing, which is a really fun, expressive, heart-opening pose. that can pretty seamlessly be woven into your yoga sequences. It's a great warm-up for poses like wheel and other bigger back bends, and it's fun to play with just in its own right. So hope you have fun.